Lovely. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Rosie. And as Rosie mentioned, in each of our church council meetings, we have a slot about safeguarding, and we set a little scenario for the PCC to discuss amongst themselves. And I'm going to do one for you now. So listen carefully, because I want you to discuss this in twos and threes around you for a few minutes. So here's the scenario. After church one Sunday, you chat with a new lady in her late 30s. You can tell by her accent that she's from overseas. Through the course of the conversation, you learn that she's come to live with an elderly relative here in Southampton. But they have very little money between them. They're relying on food parcels. She also mentions that her partner, who was British, died a few years ago. She's trying to find some paid work, but it's a challenge for her because of her background, and you fear that she could easily be taken advantage of. What do you do? So, discuss amongst yourselves for 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you for having a go at that scenario. I'm not going to ask for feedback, but we will come back to that particular scenario a little bit later on in this talk. Now, most of you will know that the Bible is a library. It's a library of 66 books written by loads of different authors over hundreds of years in lots of different contexts. And yet all these books are gathered into one book, the Bible, for a reason. And that's because there is an overarching storyline to the Bible. The story of how God invites us humans to come under his loving rule and reign. Jesus, of course, is the hero of the story, even though he's only born 2/3 of the way through, because he is the one who has perfectly lived under God's loving rule and reign. He is God with us, Emmanuel. He shows us God in the flesh, God's incredible grace and power and love and forgiveness and so on. And as the hero of the Bible, even though he's only born 2/3 of the way through the Bible, we find that the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament, all points forward to Jesus. It's a bit like the Old Testament is a shadow on the ground. And the shadow, it's 2D, it's monochrome, but it's pointing forward to Jesus. And in the New Testament, we see Jesus in all his 3D glory. And so all the Old Testament points forward to Jesus. Adam is the representative man, but brings sin to all people, where Jesus is the true and greater Adam by bringing life to all people. Jesus is the true and greater Noah by offering rescue from the coming judgment. Jesus is the true and greater Abraham by being a blessing to the nations. Moses gave the law, but Jesus is the true and greater Moses by being the ultimate lawgiver and lawkeeper. Joshua led his people to the promised land, but Jesus is the true and greater Joshua because he leads people to the eternal promised land. David was a shepherd king from Bethlehem, but Jesus is the true and greater David, the wonderful and everlasting shepherd king. Solomon was the wisest man to ever live, but Jesus is the true and greater Solomon, wisdom personified. And so it goes on. The Old Testament foreshadows the New Testament, and in particular, Jesus. And incidentally, if you want to see other ways in which the Old Testament points forward to Jesus, then I would recommend the Jesus Storybook Bible. It may be a children's Bible, but it is brilliant at showing how the Old Testament points forward to Jesus. Now, I want to focus for a few minutes on one of the less well-known characters in the Old Testament who also points forward to Jesus. And he's a chap called Boaz. Now, Boaz features in the story of Ruth. And some of you may have worked out already that the scenario I got you to do is actually the story of Ruth. Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, and her husband, Elimelech, were from Bethlehem. But during a famine, they had been forced to sell their land and emigrate. They settled in Moab, where their 2 sons married 2 Moabite women, one of whom was Ruth. And then Naomi suffered a triple tragedy. First, her husband died, and then both her sons died, leaving both Naomi and Ruth as widows. So after a while, they traveled back to Bethlehem, and Ruth accompanied Naomi. It's clear they didn't have much money. Ruth was going out in the fields trying to pick up the leftover grain that the harvesters had dropped or missed. That was legitimate. In fact, it was part of the Jewish social system, the social provision at the time, that farmers were to leave little bits unharvested so that people like Naomi and Ruth, with no other source of income, were able to scrape a living. And it turns out that the field Ruth was foraging in belonged to Boaz. And it turns out that Boaz was a distant relative of Naomi's dead husband. Now, I know it's a bit complicated to get your head around all of this if you're not familiar with the story, but we're getting to the point. We've got Naomi and Ruth, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. They're trying to survive. And we've got Boaz, a distant relative. And there's another part of the Jewish social security setup. There's a verse in Leviticus which says this: if a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. In other words, they were to be a redeemer. They were to buy back that which the poor relative had been forced to sell. And so Boaz is referred to throughout the book of Ruth as a kinsman redeemer. Kinsman because he's just about the nearest relative. Redeemer because he's bought back the land on their behalf, or does so towards the end of the story, so that the land can come back into the family line. And so, as I say, at the end of the story, Boaz does just that. He becomes the kinsman redeemer. He buys back the land, and with it, he buys responsibility, in effect, for Ruth and Naomi, providing for their future. And so how does all of that point forward to Jesus? Well, Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. He's become one of us, a kinsman. So he could redeem us and buy us back for God. The Apostle Paul puts it this way: in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace. So just as Naomi and Ruth were destitute without anyone to help them until Boaz stepped in to provide for them at great cost to himself, so we are all spiritually destitute, helpless by ourselves, until Jesus steps in to redeem us at even greater cost to himself. And just as Boaz was motivated by love to step in on behalf of Ruth and Naomi, so Christ is motivated by love when he steps in to help us and purchase our redemption on the cross. So do you see how Jesus is the true and greater Boaz? Isn't it amazing that Jesus has done this for us? But there are smaller ways in which Boaz points forward to Jesus as well. And that's to do with the way that he treats Ruth earlier on in the story. You see, these days we would class Ruth as a vulnerable adult. Now, bear with me on this one. I think you'll come to agree with me if it sounds a bit far-fetched to start on with. And don't get me wrong, Ruth was an incredibly strong person. She was courageous. She was hardworking. Indeed, in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ruth comes right after the book of Proverbs. And the book of Proverbs ends, chapter 31, with the sort of the ideal woman, if you like. And so Ruth is being presented in the Hebrew Bible as that ideal, that wonderful, perfect woman. She's a great, strong woman. But in other ways, Ruth is very vulnerable. She's a foreigner in a strange land. She's a widow dealing with grief. She has no means of income by herself, and yet she's also trying to provide for her mother-in-law. For all we know, she's in effect a carer as well. And in order to earn money, she's having to put herself in an even more vulnerable situation. She's working among people who could easily take advantage of her. So yes, she's strong and courageous, but she's also very vulnerable. And yet listen to how Boaz treats her. This is Ruth 2, verses 5 and onwards. And this is the first time that Boaz has set eyes on Ruth when he arrives to inspect how the harvest is going. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She's the Moabite who's come back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." Now, it would have been so easy for Boaz to take advantage of Ruth in that situation. We've heard all too many stories, haven't we, of men in positions of power abusing women in a vulnerable position. We read those stories in the Bible. We hear those stories in churches. We know those stories happen in the workplace and in homes. Sadly, I know that some of you have had to use the hashtag #MeToo. But it's because of Boaz that Ruth didn't need to. Boaz recognizes that Ruth is a vulnerable position, and he makes sure that she's provided for economically, but also protected physically and sexually. He says, I've told the men not to lay a hand on you. A few verses later, he's again providing for her and making sure the male workers don't even think about making her life difficult. Verse 14, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some of the stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. Now, with that level of protection and provision, Ruth is able to go home well-filled and takes plenty for Naomi as well. Naomi is overwhelmed at the provision and asks what has happened. And it's clear that Naomi has been worried about her daughter-in-law Ruth up to this point, knowing that she is in a very vulnerable position. She says to Ruth in verse 22, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So, to put it in today's language, can you see how acutely aware everyone was that Ruth was a vulnerable adult? And how Boaz took safeguarding seriously. He made his fields a safe place for Ruth to be. And this was all the more remarkable when you consider the cultural context. The very opening verse of the book of Ruth says it's set in the days when the judges ruled. And if you turn back just one page in your English Bibles, you get the book of Judges. So it's the days before there were kings, the judges are ruling, and the punchline that's repeated and comes at the very climax of the book of Judges is this. In those days, Israel had no king, everyone did as they saw fit. In other words, it was a lawless society. People could get away with whatever they wanted to do, with no retribution. And so in the days when the judges ruled, Boaz stood out like a shining light in a very dark society. And he did so because he knew God's heart for the poor, the vulnerable, the widows and orphans, the foreigner. That's a repeated theme throughout the Old Testament, God's heart for those people. And he knew that God was especially concerned for those people, not just because they were economically vulnerable with no income of their own, but also because they were physically vulnerable. They had no one to champion their cause. They had no one to stand up for them if others took advantage of them. Their access to justice was limited. And so Boaz comes and he demonstrates God's heart for the weak and vulnerable on God's behalf, providing and protecting for Ruth. And of course, Jesus is the true and greater Boaz, reflecting God's heart for the poor and vulnerable, the widow and orphan. Like Boaz, Jesus welcomed in the immigrant as well as the local. Like Boaz, Jesus exceeded the demands of the law, genuinely showing mercy to those in need. Like Boaz, Jesus was overwhelmingly generous. Do you remember all the food left over after the feeding of the 5,000? Like Boaz, Jesus paid special attention to the children and vulnerable adults, whatever the reason was for their vulnerability. Jesus is the true and greater Boaz, not just as our kinsman redeemer, but also in the way that he fulfills the law and treats the weak and the vulnerable. So what's the application from all of this for us? Well, part of the application, of course, is to turn to Jesus as our kinsman redeemer, to rejoice in what he's done for us, to thank him for redeeming us with his own blood, as we've been remembering earlier on at communion. But on this Sunday, when we're highlighting safeguarding, there's a message to us also about how we protect and provide for those who are most vulnerable in our church community and wider community, for children and vulnerable adults. Like Boaz and like Jesus, we need to pay special attention to them because that is God's heart. I know that safeguarding policies and paperwork can feel like a faff. It can seem like jumping through hoops. I get that. But believe me, we can never take for granted that our churches are safe spaces. Why? Well, because churches are full of people like me. People who still get tempted and in weak moments give in to temptation. People who still battle with sin and haven't let God transform the depths, the darkest places of my heart. Churches have got people who still battle with addictions and so on. And so we can never take for granted that churches are safe places because it's got people like me and you in them. And we've seen a depressing litany of cases in churches in recent years of people, including clergy, and including here in Southampton, of people abusing others, whether economically or physically or emotionally, and so on. And so to safeguard is to protect against potential abuse. It's not just children's group leaders who have to be checked in some ways. We have under 18s in our bands and in our tech teams, and sometimes on the coffee or welcome teams. And so all of those people need to be checked as well. We have vulnerable adults in many of our small midweek groups, so the leaders of all those groups need to be checked as well, and at Luncheon Club. It's a massive amount of work. I want to say thank you to the 90 adults in our church who have been DBS checked for one reason or another. And to say thank you to the 135 adults who have been safely recruited. That is a huge proportion of our congregation. Thank you to everyone who's done the online training modules. That is all part of helping make our church a safe place to be, as safe as possible. I want to say thank you to Suzanne for processing all the paperwork and chasing all those references. Hours and hours of work. Yes, it is a faff, but believe me, once you have sat and listened to one story of someone who has been abused in a church context, you will gladly do hours of paperwork to minimize the risk of it ever happening to someone else. It is that important. But safeguarding isn't just what happens at church, it's what happens out in the wider community as well. It's about making sure that the children and vulnerable adults we know are safe in their homes and their schools and workplaces. So when we hear about domestic abuse in the home, we have to do something about that. When we hear about a vulnerable adult being abused by a carer in their home, we have to take action. When we hear about someone feeling suicidal, we can't ignore that. And those are all instances which have happened over the last few months. So safeguarding involves all of us. It's not just Rosie, it's not just the safeguarding team, it's not just me and the PCC who hold the legal responsibility for it, but it's all of us. All of us are responsible for safeguarding. And if you hear something which doesn't look right, sound right, or you see something which doesn't look right, mention it. Mention it to Rosie or me. And whether that's as big as the scenario that I got you to talk about at the beginning, or whether it's something which seems quite innocuous and small, but it just sort of rings a warning bell in your mind, come and mention it. Because that is part of the safeguarding puzzle. And we need to put those pieces together and work with schools and others to make sure that we keep everyone as safe as possible. To show special concern for the vulnerable is to reflect God's heart. So can I encourage you to be a Boaz, to shine like a beacon in a dark world, and to do your bit to make sure that the places in which we work and worship are safe places for everyone, but especially for the most vulnerable. Now I'm going to invite us just to be quiet for a couple of minutes, just to reflect on some of what we've heard. And maybe in your minds you want to give thanks for Jesus as our ultimate kinsman redeemer. To give thanks for people like Boaz, who acted so righteously in such a dark world. Lord, would you give us the courage to be like him, to stand out from the crowd? Lord, would you give us eyes to see those who are vulnerable and to take appropriate action? And maybe there's people in your mind that you're thinking of at the moment who you know who are vulnerable. In the quietness, just pray for them. And I'm very aware that whenever we talk about safeguarding, that stirs up painful memories for some people. And whether that's linked to church or home or work or whatever the setting is, if you want to come and talk to Rosie or myself or Josh or Angel afterwards, then please do. I'm going to invite Hannah to come up, and she's going to carry on leading us in our prayers around safeguarding.